here, and I'm really interested to learn about what everyone's doing. So I know some of what's going on here, and I think it's South Africa is a really great place that can, I think, teach a lot of world a lot in meeting the challenges of the Anthropocene. So, unlike Belinda said, Unsi asked me specifically to address this issue of sort of the big picture. And so that's what I'm going to try and talk today about is sort of not South Africa, but the global era we're in. And I'm going to, what I kind of call the challenges of the Anthropocene, which is basically the idea of that, we're transforming the planet while there's still huge demands of poverty and impoverishment around the world. And so how do we reconcile these things? So the Anthropocene, I'm sure as you're all familiar with, is this idea that we're now living in this epoch that is where the operating of the Earth system is dominated by people. This picture I have up here is from one of the guys who's done lots of work on the Anthropocene, Earl Ellis. And he's developed this concept of anthromes rather than biomes, of this idea that they're anthropogenic biomes, that people and nature sort of co-shape. And this is basically a map that's trying to show the history of intensive use of ecosystems around the world. And as you can see, like sort of in India, China, Mesoamerica, there's many areas where there's actually quite a long history, but this sort of for the entire planet, this is new. So the point of this picture is for most of the Earth's surface, humanity is a strong, dominating force. And in many areas of the world, this has actually been going on for centuries, if not millennia. And so we really need to kind of better understand how this human-dominated planet works. And of course, as you're aware, this has resulted in huge transformations of the world's biomes, but this is quite uneven. And as you see, like it's in South Africa, we're here in a very, very transformed one. But there's sort of, in some of them, there's expected not to be so much more transformation in the next few years. And in others, there's expected to be quite a lot more, say in tropical forests. And if we look at this sort of in a metabolic way, human civilization has greatly increased the amount of energy that's flowing through us. And I like this graph, which is from a social metabolism group in Austria. So it points out that basically as we've used, this is fossil fuels with a tiny bit of nuclear and hydropower on top. As we've increasingly used fossil fuels, this use of fossil fuels hasn't decoupled us, hasn't decoupled us from nature, as many in rich countries believe, but actually we've used these fossil fuels energy to extract more from nature, which is this increasing use of biomass. And if we look at just materials from the same group, you can see this in this very rapid growth. This is on half the time scale, just from the 19th century. And in my life, from here, basically the extraction of materials and use by human civilization has doubled. So saying we're having this really big acceleration in how we transform the planet, not just in land use, but in our intensity of our use and modification of ecosystems. And of course, for all the biologists here, this has had consequences for biodiversity. And we're almost certainly in the sixth great mass extinction. This is from the Millennium Assessment, showing the estimated pre-human extinction rates, the historic, and the expected future, where this is a logarithmic scale, and we're having this huge rate of extinctions, but we're also homogenizing the world's fauna, reducing genetic diversity, reducing the population size, decreasing the range of all these species, with uncertain consequences for the functioning of ecosystems. So then the other side of this, of course, this hasn't happened for just no reason. There's been a huge change in people on Earth. I like this little graph, it's a little bit weird, from The Economist. And this is a graph showing the number of human lives over time and economic output over centuries. So you can maybe ignore just a little bit in the 21st century. But you can see we've done a big chunk of how much there was in the 20th century in only a few years of the 21st century. And you can see how many more human lives and this massive increase in economic activity around the planet. And what does this mean? This is huge increases in human income, globally speaking, in the last 200 years. So here's a graph with estimates of gross world product per capita, so the average income of people in the world. You see it's gradually, very slowly increasing to about the early 18th century, and then this rapid increase. So you had this very slow growth from 1,000 to 2,000, from 1,000 to 1820, and then this explosion of 32 times more growth per person, along with this huge growth in world population in this last 200 years. And of course, this wealth is not evenly shared, but if we look just in a shorter time, there actually have been really substantial declines in global extreme poverty. But these have been unequal. So this black line is showing globally, and this is a percentage in these regions, not numbers. So this is in the globe. You can see a very rapid decline basically in China, India, but sort of more stagnation in other areas, even though there has been, I think, quite a bit of change if you went up to 2012 looking in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's progress, but still persistence of extreme poverty. And looking at this in a more broad way, I'll probably wear the Human Development Index, which tries to combine life expectancy, income, and education, you see this really broad trend where there's progress in all the world's regions of improving human development. And this is mostly due to gains in life expectancy and education. And this is showing, a bit messy here, bridge windows, but the 10 biggest countries in terms of people in the world. And if you can vaguely see, there's some countries that slow down, but these are basically like Zimbabwe, which even Zimbabwe has gone up a little bit. So this is kind of the tension, if that there's more people, there's a much bigger economy, and this economy relies upon the biosphere, while at the same time we're transforming the biosphere in ever-increasing ways. So I kind of think of this as sort of this challenge of the biosphere. There's more people, and they're more better off than they've ever been before. But a huge chunk, about a seventh or a sixth of the world's population, depending on how you look at it, is impoverished, doesn't have good food to eat, doesn't have opportunities to have a good life. And to get this huge growth in wealth and people, we've had this massive transformation of the planet, and it's been more in the last 50 years than any other time in human history. And these are pushing the planet into potentially a dangerous state. They're certainly pushing it into a novel state, and we have some evidence that this might be worrying. And so to me, this is a challenge, is that we're going into this Anthropocene, and how can we make this not a catastrophe, but a good Anthropocene, where people can thrive and have good lives in a world that they are supporting rather than undercutting. So this is sort of a bit from popular culture. You can sort of think, well, what are the visions of the Anthropocene? And so some movies and books, the sort of super bleak, maybe the Monday morning version of things is Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which is basically everyone's dying, everything's dead, and it's just can you keep going for a little bit and you find it. To versus vision from California in the 1970s of Ecotopia, where we could have some kind of low-impact, sustainable society, or maybe some of you, it's hard to find a techno-green vision, but this is one of them. This is a science fiction novel about people terraforming Mars, and it has a lot of ecological ideas in it, to something like The Economist, where you see that their picture for the Anthropocene is very much this engineered world. And I think this is a bit of a tension of ideas about the Anthropocene. Most of the discourse is between either the Anthropocene means we're destroying the world, or that we're in command of it and we can do whatever we want. And I think it's probably most of us in this room are aware we can't do whatever we want with nature, and there's hopefully some chance we're not destroying it. So one of the ways people have thought about this is in terms of planetary boundaries, which is the idea that there's, I guess Brian is one of the developers of that idea, the idea that there's some kind of space that defines the Holocene. And we've pushed the planet beyond some of these boundaries, and we should try and not push it too far because we're going to produce bad things. And then people from the development world, Kate Raffers from Oxford, has said, well, there's a whole bunch of social goals you can kind of think that we want to have minimum levels of social equity, energy, jobs, participation. And so in that, we could say there's some kind of safe and just space that we want to develop for in the Anthropocene. We want to avoid catastrophic environmental change. We want to have a good society. So that's kind of a vision. And of course, it's a little bit harder to figure out how to get there than to define it. So that's what I'm going to try and talk a little bit about. So one of the things that I've been a bit interested in is a sort of a disconnect in ecological thinking. So Albert put up this figure a little bit. This is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where the idea there's a whole bunch of ecosystem services which contribute to human well-being. And these arrows are kind of an attempt to assess the evidence of what different things do. But I would say basically we know a lot about these provisioning services. We know a little about some of the regulating services, and we know very little about the cultural services. We know a lot about basic material needs for a good life. We know much less about all these other ones. So this is a preliminary attempt. But the point being that the Millennium Assessment and say us or the environmental community believe that nature is essential for humanity. And I showed these graphs showing that we get a lot of our energy from the biosphere. But I also showed these graphs earlier on and all these ecosystem services assessed in different categories, in different provisioning, regulating, cultural. The red are ones that are declining, the yellow ones that are constant, and the green are ones that are increasing. So basically, the Millennium Assessment showed that all the ecosystem services, except for agricultural ones, are declining. And yet, we say, so ecosystem services are essential for human well-being. All the ecosystem services are declining, yet human well-being is going up. So to me, that is this idea there's a bit of a paradox between these things. And of course, there's explanations for this. But I think this is something that SAPEX and the environmental research community have to better address to basically not just convince ourselves that environment is really important, but be able to convince non-environmentalists, convince government ministers, economists, and the general public that the environment is important. And so, of course, you're probably already thinking, well, of course, this is an apparent paradox, but there's different reasons for this. And what I find interesting is if you talk to different research communities, they say, well, this paradox is obviously explained by one of these hypotheses. But they're different ones from different research communities. So some people would claim that human well-being is not really increasing, its life is worse. But I would say, and I just sort of showed Seth as saying that that's really not true. It's hard to find any kind of data set at a global level or a big aggregate level where human well-being isn't actually increasing, despite problems in areas and lots of persistent poverty being lived. And then agricultural people would say, well, that's clearly from what you just showed, that it's really agricultural ecosystem services that are much more important than everything else. They're going up. It's the other ones that are going down. That's what explains things. Economists or engineers might say, well, it's because we're so brilliant, we don't really need ecosystems anymore. We can live off our technology as decoupled us from nature. Fossil fuels, iPhones, make everything great. And the ecologist response would be like, well, no, we're the people who just jumped off the top of a building and everything's great for now, and in a little bit we're going to hit the ground. So there's some kind of lags. But some colleagues and I just tried to assess the evidence for this and saying, as we're just indicating, there's lots of evidence that well-being has gone up, and that the support for the first hypothesis is pretty weak. There's also lots of evidence that agriculture, food production, really, really matters a lot. It's strongly supported. There's not so much evidence that we've decoupled from the biosphere. I showed you this graph already. But there's lots of things basically where people get more resources or more technology, we use that to get more from the biosphere. So we could reduce our impact, but we don't, right? We use more and more and more. And then the fourth one, this one, I think, which is where we have the chance to contribute, there's actually not that much evidence of there really being a big impact of biosphere degradation or time lags. That's a lot of our work is based on the impacts of the negative impacts at a large scale for human well-being of ecosystem service decline isn't really so convincing. And this is, I think, something that I personally believe this is true, but I think we need to get more evidence of this at a large scale, because you can show it for local places, but then people move other places, and overall, human well-being has improved. And I think we need to kind of a bit disentangle or move away from this. We have really good understanding of how people are transforming the biosphere and what this does to biodiversity, to ecosystems, but we don't have so much understanding of what this actually means for human well-being. And I think this is more how the ecological community needs to shift a little bit and work more closely with social scientists to better understand, well, what do these changes actually mean for people? And that maybe also has something to do about what it means for biodiversity, because what happens for biodiversity is going to be shaped by what happens to people. So, and just to think about this evidence a lot, I think one of the things that I think is very interesting is if you look about how we think about answering these questions. So if you talk with economists, or the kind of economic thinking, the sort of Bjorn Lomborg kind of thing, you're saying, well, we've had all these crises in the past, and ecologists or environmental Malthusians have been wrong in the past, and therefore they're likely to be wrong in the future. Well, ecologists are often more looking forward, of saying, well, but if present tense continue, we're going to get into this big problem, and it's going to be different this time. And I think this is one of these things where we need to better link across these two things. So in the past, we've had this evidence, ecosystems are declined, human well-being has been up, we've been able to cope with previous crises. But then in the future, we see, well, there's novelty, there's new types of relations. We have quite a bit of evidence, like with these exponential growths, we know it can't continue forever. We can't use 120% of the Earth's ecosystems. We can't use 120% of the Earth's primary production, right? There are some real limits there that we just can't keep growing. And that these future trajectories are going to, as we dominate the planet, are shaped by new types of socio-ecological interactions that we need to understand. And I think something for like the PECS program, it's kind of fitting with this quote I like from William Gibson, American-Canadian science fiction writer. He was when we're talking about technology, but it's really, there's seeds of different futures around us today in all sorts of places. You could say like the world could go this way or that way. And by looking at these kind of things and promoting the types of futures we want that are already thriving, we can hopefully make good ones spread and help divert the bad ones. So I work at the Stockholm Resilience Center, so we like turbulence and resilience. And as I've talked about before, these are all these very smooth curves. But we know this isn't the case. And so if we're thinking about the future, we have to think about ecological surprises. And if we look back to the past, we think, well, there's just been lots of ways that people have been surprised. And despite there being increases of human well-being, if we'd avoided these things, we probably would have had much more ability to increase human well-being. And just some of the things that were real surprises in development in the 20th century is the rapid evolution of resistance of pests to pesticides and biocides, the biomagnification of toxins like mercury and PCB through food chains, emergence of disease by transformations of ecosystems that were meant to improve people's well-being but led to them getting sick with things like river blindness, and how the simplification of ecosystems led to more instability in ecosystems. Just some examples. And so you can kind of think, well, what potentially could be some of the things that could happen now in this 21st century, and can we get ahead of them and avoid making these same kind of mistakes? And just one example of maybe a potential novel connection is the sort of 2008 food crisis, which of course is still continuing with this, not necessarily just high food prices, but you had this long period of stability with food prices and oil prices, and now basically things are fluctuating around a lot. And this is at least probably partially true due to some kind of getting close to limits in not being able to increase oil extraction to lower the price of oil. The oil price remains high despite all this fracking and everything. And then food prices also are more coupled to oil now because of the high energy inputs and uses of biofuels. So you have all these very big spikes in food prices. And there's the connection between the different crops as well. Another thing, I'm somewhat skeptical of this, but this is from the UN Human Development Report from this year, based on some global modeling done in the United States. And these are projections of extreme poverty based on continuing current progress and development in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, and then what the future trajectories would be if basically climate change has substantial impacts on agriculture. So this isn't actually thinking about any other environmental changes other than climate change and agriculture. But this would show that if these sort of disasters occur, the impact would be far worse than any kind of gains in progress, so that the cost of environmental impacts on development is far bigger than the efforts towards development. And if you look at this globally, you can see the same project, they looked at, well, if we tried to have accelerated poverty alleviation, we could reduce poverty much faster. This is what we expect with kind of the current process. And this is what we get if we get some kind of environmental disaster, which you can see the increase in the number of people living in extreme poverty is massive compared to the difference here, which to me suggests that rather than talking about improving development, we should maybe be talking a bit more about avoiding these environmental disasters, which we're not doing. So with some talk about disaster, now I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience. I think really resilience is a really key point for thinking about the Anthropocene, because we can expect the Anthropocene not to just be this continuation of smooth trends, but be something where we're going to have surprise, loss, reorganization, and transformation if we want to have a good Anthropocene. And the resilience, because it thinks about these things, can be a useful sort of operating system or framework for thinking about the Anthropocene, because resilience has this sort of dual nature. One side is about having the ability to persist despite shocks of the things you want to keep, but the other idea about reorganizing to change in ways that you want to change, to build something better. And I think these are the real challenges for science, is to try and understand those things. So I'm just going to kind of wrap up with a few things. So my view of thinking about the Anthropocene is, I know Brian might disagree, but I think with these concepts of planetary boundaries, what the planetary boundary says, we've crossed a bunch of those boundaries, and despite kind of talk about staying within planetary boundaries, we can't. We can't go back. Climate change, modification of biochemical cycles of nutrients, of phosphorus and nitrogen, of biodiversity change, we can't reverse those, at least on any time of human timescale. So I think we need to learn how to live in the Anthropocene and think about what kind of good Anthropocene we want to have, rather than say we want to go back to a past. And to do this, we need to kind of think about how we're going to live in a turbulent world that's novel, and we're going to have experiments, we're going to have to acknowledge diversity and learn from diversity, and think much more about looking forward as well as looking back. And I believe there's a lot of potential. There's no physical reason or no biological reason why we couldn't have a good Anthropocene where we have this novel, turbulent world that supports human well-being. But I think it's probably, all of you are aware, there are lots of forces that are keeping us on a very bad trajectory. And even with things like climate change, where we know a lot about them, there's really a failure to deal with them. And that's worrying, this failure of social learning, not to understand things, but to actually do something. So, but just to point out some things, I think there's a lot of opportunity to do better. This is a graph that I like from work from Steve Pulaski and others in the United States, and they were looking just simply on biodiversity versus economy trade-offs. They had a very sophisticated model, and they're economists, and so the economists usually think, well, you have to think about trade-offs, and there's this sort of trade-off curve, and where do you want to be? Do you want to have more biodiversity, more economy, and we should socially make a choice about that. But when they actually look at the actual landscape, not this potential surface, it's on there well away from this curve. And what this means is basically there's a whole bunch of changes you can do where you don't have a trade-off between biodiversity and the economy. You can do better in both because you're doing things so poorly. And I think there's lots of examples in the world that just from kind of how people insulate their houses or so, where there's lots of things where you can do better if we kind of organize to do it without having even complex choices. So that's a potential. There's something that I think isn't discussed so much in kind of meetings of ecologists and social scientists is the importance of engineering and design. I think this is something like in South Africa is very interesting for South Africa in the world. There's this huge process of urbanization going on in the planet. So people are building all this stuff. And if we build stuff that's bad and erodes the ability of ecosystems to support human well-being, or we build stuff that's good, it's going to have a huge impact on both the present and future generations. But one of the challenges is we often kind of, we as scientists, engineers, don't know how to do this. We don't know how to do good things. So you could think about, say, design for the Anthropocene is you want to build things that are not having a negative impact on the functioning of ecosystems or the biosphere, but a positive one. But how can you do this? And this is an example of pre-Columbian ecological engineering in the Amazon, where people actually improve the productivity of their soil by adding charcoal and other things to it. So this is non-anthropogenic soil, and this is anthropogenic soil. So this is far more productive than this. So people enhanced their ecosystem. And you can kind of think about, well, what could be some answers to what could be ecologically positive? So you can think about things more, that you build something that's more like a tree than a parking lot. that you have something that's climate or ecologically neutral or more rather than be neutral, you're carbon negative or something like that. That you enhance the diversity of species, landscapes, ecosystems. That you enhance the ecological benefits to people rather than destroying them. Or you change the way that people are benefiting and experiencing the costs of your design. And so this isn't really an answer to this question, but I think these would be really useful if engineering students and government planners thought about their things when they're building roads and tower blocks in cities. And this is something I think there's a lot of opportunity in South Africa as this huge building boom is going on. Another way of thinking about this, I think, is that you can think in the Anthropocene, we have less ability to control things, and we have a lot of uncertainty or unknowability about what's going to happen. But most of our scientific and engineering and economic tools are for this kind of space, where we can control stuff and we know how to do it. So we can optimize agriculture, we can optimize networks, but lots of things we don't have ability to control because we can't tell people what to do, or we physically can't control things because they're out of our control. And there, if we understand things, we can build resilience. If we can control things and we don't understand them, we can do experiments and try and learn. But then up here, where we don't understand things and we can't control them, we have to do new stuff. And I think as scientists, we need to develop new methods, new approaches, which I know people in South Africa are working on, to try and understand things and make them more knowable and make them more controllable so we can do more about it. And this is, I think, there's huge opportunities for science to work in those arenas. And so just to sort of finish, I think you can identify lots, and this is just a few examples of research challenges that the Anthropocene brings, of trying to better understand how people are connected to nature, about what types of novel ecosystems could occur and what are their benefits and costs to other ecosystems. So to try and be asking questions that are looking forward, to try and understand how to govern multiple ecosystem services in complex dynamic contexts, to try and better understand how the cultural values, how regulating ecosystem services, how people are able to organize themselves are all affected by ecosystems. So about thinking more broadly about this than just the stuff that comes from ecosystems, but how ecosystems affect people's psychology and social relations is really a huge frontier. As I mentioned, I think better connecting to engineering and design to think about how we can actually build or co-create a good Anthropocene. We need to actually work with the people who change the landscape. And then finally, in kind of a more theoretical sense, we need to understand all these processes of transformation, of both how to navigate transformation that's imposed on you, but also how to try and steer towards good outcomes and identify good outcomes. And this, again, I think with all the transformation that South Africa has gone through, is something where South Africa can potentially really contribute a lot to the world. So not being a South African researcher, this is maybe a bit just reaching a bit totally wrong, but I thought I'd just try and provoke. I think there's some, as I've been mentioning, some real opportunities to address this kind of research agenda in SA Apex. I think, as seen by all the people who came to this meeting, there's actually a really strong research community in South Africa compared to many other middle-income countries in the world or developing countries. And yet you share the situations and problems of the bulk of the world's population. So South Africa is one of the countries that really has a leading role to try and grapple with some of these issues. And there's a lot of great opportunity for collaboration here. I think the social and ecological diversity or socio-ecological diversity of South Africa allows lots of potential for comparison and learning between places. The existing focus on ecosystem services and poverty also provides a lot of opportunity to try and learn how to do these kind of things well and what are interesting things to do. Rapid urbanization and the connection between the rural and the urban, I think, are something that's really important both for South Africa and for the world as a whole. And then I think this idea of like South Africa both having its own internal transformations, both that are kind of coming from the outside world or coming up as people are organizing in new ways, and this sort of new connections through globalization to the rest of the world and how they affect South Africa. Those are all really interesting questions that people could grapple with. So, thanks very much. So.